Today I'm making Wrecker's helmet from the Bad Batch. For this build, I used EVA foam dowels, craft foam, coffee foam, putty, super glue, contact cement, plastidip, sharpening stone, modified clone DNA, paint, cutting tools, sanding tools, safety gear, scissors, razor pens, and a box cutter. First, I traced a helmet dome template onto a sheet of EVA foam floor mat. I made this dome template years ago and have been refining it ever since. There's a link to it in the video description down below, along with a complete Wrecker helmet template, which I developed over the course of this build. I flipped the shapes to get the reverse side. Sometimes I'll connect the two halves in the middle or in the front just to help hide the seam, where it's going to be most visible, but sometimes that can make gluing a little bit more difficult, and the seam is going to be covered up on this particular helmet anyway, so I put some separation between the two. As I trace, I'm making sure to get all the registration marks so that I can line up the pieces later. And I'm labeling them front, back, left, and right just to prevent further confusion. I've definitely made two left sides before. Next, I cut out the pieces with the box cutter. Make sure to cut with the blade angled straight up and down, otherwise you'll get a ridge in your armor, which can be useful if you're making medieval armor or something highly stylized, but sci-fi, not so much. They actually make a tool for that now to hold the blade straight up and down. It's like a handle with a razor blade on it. The EVA foam will dull out your blade, so you'll have to continually sharpen it with a knife sharpener. I switched to scissors for some of the simpler cuts, and then finished them off with a work knife. I also made side pieces, then I heat formed them with a heat gun, not a hairdryer. A heat gun. Your hairdryer can't do this. In fact, it'll burn the foam if you hold it over the same spot long enough, which is why I do most of the heating up on the pattern side, which is going to end up on the inside when the helmet's done. Then I manipulated the foam manually until it was curved slightly, and then so that it would retain its curve, I set it inside a bowl while it cooled. Make sure you use Darth Vader's helmet as a heat former for this step. That's the only way it'll work. Thanks, Darth Vader!
Don't mention it.
Once all the pieces were heat formed, I glued them together with contact cement. The fumes from this stuff aren't great to breathe, so I'm doing this in an open garage on a windy day. That wasn't by choice, it just happened to be windy that particular day, which worked out well. You can't just apply the glue to the foam and then immediately stick it together. There's a 12 to 14 minute wait time. Contact cement is a bit temperamental, and it's something that has to be done in stages. But for the longevity of a prop that's probably going to bend over time, suffer some kind of stress, it's really the best glue. When the glue had become tacky, I attached the pieces. Then I applied the glue to the center seam, and when the glue had dried, I attached the two halves to form a dome. Then I cut a rectangle from a sheet of EVA foam to form the sides and back of the helmet. I sanded the rough edges on my belt sander. Then I heat formed it and glued it to the dome with more contact cement. It's pretty much self-explanatory. There's not much more for me to say about it that I haven't said already. I'd use the in-cam dialogue here, but it's predominantly lawnmowers. Seems like I only do this when people are running lawnmowers. I took a look at the reference images, and I'm actually going to have to cut a little behind the seam, like a ½ inch here and a full inch here. And that's why we don't record outside. To keep the pieces from separating while they dried, I weighed them down with a tape spool. It was closer than my machinist blocks. My 1-2-3 tape. Then I figured out the dimensions of the inner faceplate and cut it up. Well, I shouldn't say figured it out. This was a guess, and I did modify it later. This will be the blank base on which I can build Wrecker's more detailed face covering, so I can be less precise with it for now. It was a little bit of trial and error, but eventually I got it to fit, and so I glued it in place, despite the drawbacks of a well-ventilated workspace. Of course there are flies. There's no food in here. There is only poison in this garage. I would love it if that fly got caught in the contact cement. That's what we call a fly log. Oh god, kill me now. Then I let it sit overnight to air out, and in the meantime, I worked on the outer faceplate. So normally you wouldn't want to use black Sharpie because it's very difficult to remove when you inevitably paint it. But in keeping with the Clone Wars aesthetic, Bad Batch has that sort of hand-painted look, and this will actually help make the edge pop. I'm using white EVA foam to cut down on the painting process. I try to do that wherever I can. I'm actually doing that stopping thing on purpose. It's trying to just glide right through there, and if I let it, I could deviate from my trace really easily. Think we should use a straight edge, Jake? Nah. Kind of cool. It's like a handle to a knife, right? Like a Klingon disruptor handle. I'm debating whether I should cut a dart in here like I did with the like I do with the side pieces, or if I should just heat form the heck out of it. I think I'm going to heat form the heck out of it. This is my planishing iron. I made it from a failed infinity gem jewel, the center thing of Loki's staff. Yeah, so I was trying to make this and ended up with this. Not even close. And I set it into a pasta sauce can filled with bits of resin flash because I don't want that going in the ocean. Getting there. Looks kind of like a bever. Wait a minute. Is it a bever? Like a space bever? If you flip it, then it's like a salad helmet bever, right? I should do more knight stuff, like medieval stuff. Yeah, nice. Nice. I heat formed that, and then traced where it was going to go on the helmet. This is to help me center it while gluing. Then I applied the glue. 14 minutes later, I attached the pieces. As I stated earlier, I did have to refine it a bit after the fact, because it was looking a bit too wide. I realized that this was in part because the rim was too low, so I had to cut that down to size as well. And that was a very quick and dirty cut. I did have to sand it afterwards because it came out a little bit jagged. The faceplate turned out to be a little bit too wide, so I slimmed it down a bit, and then modified the templates to match. That doesn't look so great right now, but don't worry, I'll fix it later. For the bridge of the nose and eye hole edges, I used slanted offcuts from past builds. I think either BD1 or one of the flamethrowers. Probably both. I don't remember. I use white for the exterior and gray for the interior, just to save on paint. A lot of my foam choices on this build are to save on paint. I'm also using super glue to save time. You can't use it for the main seams because it doesn't flex, and your helmet could more than likely break apart, especially over time. But for the detail pieces, it's fine. Also, it's less toxic than contact cement. You don't need to worry so much about safety gear. Oh, that went in my eye. Ah, my eye! I'm not supposed to get epoxy resin in it. Oh, God, seared like tuna steaks. Always wear eye protection. Always. This has been a public service announcement brought to you by my cornea. The slanted detail works so well in the front for the cheekbones that I decided to cut more from a sheet of white foam floor mat, which is clearly a remnant from a stormtrooper build. Oh, also, make sure you cut towards yourself while shirtless because your appendix has to come out sometime. Why not sooner rather than later? How did he die? How didn't he die? When my conscious memories had been downloaded into a new clone body, I got back to work. When I was finished, the rim detail turned out to be this many squares long. I attached it with super glue, weighted it down with machinist blocks while it dried, which wasn't very long, and then cut the earpieces. They're just scrap gray foam floor mats with an angle cut in one end and then nestled up against the white rim. Then I covered up all the seams, mistakes, with black 2mm craft foam. And it's like my mistakes never happened. Erased from existence. Oh, I gotta sand that. That's just portable belt sander. He's got a little red square on the back of his helmet to make it easy for the snipers, so I cut that from a red foam floor mat and then put a little bit of a curve in it with my heat gun. Then I super glued that onto the back and made a slightly taller one from 2mm red foam to overlap the white rim detail. You'll notice that I already started the puttying back there. I had to halt this project partway through a couple of times to deal with real life. And when I came back to it, I realized that I didn't actually need to putty all of this helmet seams. It would help in some areas, but not necessarily the top, because I'm going to make that racing stripe detail out of 2mm white craft foam. I did this by tracing the edges of random stuff I found around my workshop. I cut it out, refined the edges, and carefully glued it on. The super glue is drying in just a few seconds, which does not leave me a lot of working time. It's probably because we're in a heat wave right now. And if I make a mistake, the foam will rip as I try to remove it, which will then cause me to have to make a whole new identical piece. So, I'm doing this in segments of only a few inches of the edge at a time. Then I cut segments from a dowel, foam dowel that is, for the details on the faceplate. They're supposed to be a little cone shaped, so I sanded the edges on my belt sander until they were. Notice the mask? You don't want to be breathing this dust. Then I glued them onto the faceplate and mapped out where the air holes would go. Then I cut them out with a combination of the pipe technique and a razor pen. Then I covered up the last of my mistakes with triangles cut from more white 2mm foam and used just a little bit of putty to touch up some of the edges and hide the dart seam on the other side. Then I covered up the white parts with blue painter's tape. This is to protect it from drips and overspray. Then I used dark gray spray paint to erase the putty and notation marks. So I painted over it with gray spray paint because I couldn't find my gray plastidip until immediately after I finished. How's that for timing? And you can see on the dart seam where I've covered it up with putty, it blended that really nicely. And it started to until I gave up on this seam. But I did that because I realized there's supposed to be a painted on line edge. He's got these two black stripes on either side of the white one. So I could putty that, but it's just gonna be erased by the black paint anyway. So it's like, you know, waste of putty. So before I take the tape off, I'm gonna go over this with flat black paint. And I'm gonna brush it on just because it's hard to get a straight edge with spray paint without masking. More masking, I mean. I left the painter's tape on for the next painting step, which is just two black stripes. You have to really unload your brush before applying the paint, otherwise it'll run and can even make its way under the painter's tape. After it had dried, I peeled off the tape. Then I cut up scraps of that tape to make the design on the front. Then I painted it with the same flat black as before. I peeled that tape up before it had finished drying, just so that I could refine the edges a little bit before they set in. Then I drew the pattern onto the forehead, which is a regular old red Sharpie. I used scraps of welding visor left over from one of my many Mandalorian helmet builds. I forget which one. And that was it. That's how I made a Wrecker helmet. What's your favorite trooper helmet? Let me know in comments below. This video is brought to you by my patrons. Their support is the main thing that allows me to make these videos. If you'd like to join them so that I could build even more elaborate props and costumes, then you can do so by following the link down below. And then maybe one day I'll be able to afford a real prop making facility. I can see it now. Patron levels are rising. For real? The fools! God, wait, no, they're falling again. Oh, wait, no, no, bring it back. Well, what can we afford now? Typical. Support me on Patreon and I promise I won't become a supervillain. Alright, was that everything? Build a helmet, support me on Patreon, promise I'm not evil. Oh, hit the bell icon, and yeah, that's it. Happy crafting. See you later.